Hi everybody, my name is Lexi and welcome to Life Science Live from the Monty L. Bean Museum. I'm gonna wait just a minute and let anybody who wants to jump on, and then we're gonna get started and talk about keystone species today. All right, I'm gonna get started. So today we're gonna talk about keystone species. If you don't know what a keystone species is, a keystone species is one specific species that affects a bunch of other species in an ecosystem. Those keystone species are the species that are like the glue that hold the ecosystem together. If they are removed, then that ecosystem becomes unbalanced and unhealthy. And so these keystone species are really, really important. We like to think of a keystone species like a keystone in an arc. If you think of an arc, you can think that there's two sides to it, and there's always a stone right in the middle that each the right and the left side lean on. And so if that keystone or that stone is removed from the arc, then the sides will collapse and there will be no support. And so these keystone species create support for all the other species to lean on. And so I'm going to talk to you guys about some examples of keystone species today. First, I want to explain a keystone species that is on the west coast of North America in the Pacific Ocean, and that is the sea otter. And so this is a river otter, so it's not the exact same species, but we'll just use him as an example. So sea otters and river otters are pretty similar. They have this really, really thick coat that is very, very warm. It's the warmest coat almost of any animal. And it is also waterproof, and so it keeps them warm while they spend the majority of their time in their life in the water. And so what they do is they feed on sea urchins. So this is an example of a sea urchin. This is a very delicate specimen, but this is a sea urchin. It has a ton of these huge spikes. They're really strong, and they are really durable and pokey sometimes. And then they have this really intense, if you can see that, those are its jaws. This is called Aristotle's lantern, and that's its nickname, but these are the sea urchin's jaws. And so these sea urchins are actually vicious predators, and what they like to prey on are kelp. So they live at the base of kelp forests in the Pacific Ocean, and what they do is they will use their little legs. I don't know if you can really tell. These little legs can help them move along the ocean floor, and they will gnaw and chew on the base of kelp. And so they can eradicate whole kelp forests if they don't have any predators to worry about. Here is another specimen. It's got a lot of things on the inside, but they're pretty large. This one has no spikes on it, but that's where its mouth would be. And so these sea urchins can eradicate, like I said, complete kelp forests, and so they need the sea otter to be able to keep their population at bay. So what the sea otters do, they have adaptations that allow them to break open and handle these things without hurting their hands or hurting their jaws, and they will dive down to the bottom of the ocean and rip these guys off and feed on them. And so sea otters will eat about 25% of their body weight every single day, and so if they're sea otters, they can take care of keeping these sea urchins at bay, their populations, to not overpopulate and to overeat, because if they overeat, then the kelp forests will be completely destroyed, and then that creates an unbalanced and unhealthy ecosystem. And so otters, sea otters, are an example of a keystone species. Another example of keystone species is the sea star, or starfish. We like to call them sea stars since they're not actually fish. But sea stars are also pretty vicious predators, and they feed on mussels. And so what they do is they live in tide pools on the west coast as well, more northwest, and they will feed on mussels in the tide pools there. And so I'll show you the other side. If you've never seen the bottom of a starfish, they have all these legs. When they're alive, they have all these legs that line that come out and are able to help their arms move. And here's their mouth. And so they will keep the mussel population at bay. So if there are no sea stars, if the sea stars are removed, then the mussels will overpopulate, and they will overcrowd those tide pools. Because since they're not very large ecosystems, they're pretty closed and small. If there are too many mussels, then the other species can't live there. And so there's about 12 other native species that prefer living in those tide pools. And so if there are mussels there and they overpopulate, then those 12 species will be overcrowded out of those tide pools. But with the sea star there, it can keep the mussel population controlled and allow those other 12 native species to thrive. So that's two examples, short examples of keystone species. And for my last example, I want to talk about wolves and how wolves are keystone species. I'm sitting here next to our gray wolf exhibit with these musk ox, but we're going to only just talk about the wolves, and we're going to talk about specifically the population of wolves in Yellowstone National Park. And so Yellowstone is a park in Wyoming and some of Montana and Idaho, but Yellowstone in the 1920s, it was really, really common for people to go and hunt wolves in Yellowstone. And in about 1926, the wolves were completely hunted until they were eradicated. They weren't in the park anymore. There were no more wolves left. And so at first people thought this was going to be a positive thing because wolves are predators and they hunt and kill deer and elk. And so they thought that this would be really good for the park, for the wolves to be able to hunt, or to not be able to hunt the deer and elk anymore. And so there would be more deer and elk for people that were coming to visit and see the park for them to see. And so they thought this was going to be a good thing, and there was about 70 years where there were no wolves in Yellowstone National Park. And for us, 70 years is a very long time, but in science and in nature, 70 years is a very, very short amount of time. But in that short span of time, there were a lot of changes because the wolves were no longer there. These wolves are a keystone species, and so there were a lot of different effects that caused, negative effects that were caused because the wolves weren't there. So in those 70 years, the biggest thing that they saw a change in were the rivers. Because there were so many more deer and elk, because they didn't have any predators anymore, they could go out and they could hunt or they could feed on and graze wherever they wanted. They could go all the way out into the wide open and be able to eat without any fear of predators. And that caused a change in the rivers. So I'm going to show you a picture. Here is the river in Yellowstone without any wolves. So you can see that this river doesn't have a lot of direction in it. It kind of looks more like a puddle than a river. And you can see that all around this river it's pretty barren. There's not a lot of trees. You can see some trees, but there is absolutely no grass and no shrubs on the banks or the sides of this river. You can see it's pretty shallow. There's some rocks on the middle part, and so this river doesn't have a lot of structure to it. And that's the important thing to know about rivers, is that they need structure. So they need plants and shrubs along the sides in order to bring structure to the river, because plants and grasses and trees, they all have roots, and those roots go into the ground and they create structure for the dirt and the soil. And so without those roots, the dirt and the soil can move and can flatten out as much as it wants, and the water can move it a lot. But with those roots, the soil and the dirt is a lot more stable and a lot less likely to move. So, since those wolves were no longer there, and scientists were noticing a difference. They thought that it would be a good idea to reintroduce the wolves into Yellowstone National Park. So in the 1990s, about 70 years after the wolves were hunted out of Yellowstone, they introduced a pack of 14 wolves back into Yellowstone National Park. And those 14 wolves were able to thrive. They had a ton of deer to hunt on. And so over a short amount of time, the park saw a huge difference in balance and in health that was brought to the ecosystem in Yellowstone. So with the wolves there, they were able to cut back the population of the deer and the elk, and so they weren't able to eat as much brush and as much grass and as many trees. And so because there were more trees, more shrubs, more grass, this allowed a lot of other species to thrive and to come back to the park. And one of those species were beavers. Beavers, we know, use trees to create their dams and rivers. And so with more trees in the park, those beavers were able to thrive there, and they had plenty of trees to cut down and to create their dams is where they live. And because there were dams in the river, that created some still water compared to the fast water that allowed for frogs to lay their eggs. So they had to lay their eggs in still water, so their tadpoles weren't washed away by the fast water. And so a lot of amphibians like frogs and salamanders became more common to see in the park. And a lot of more birds were seen in the park since there were so many more trees. The birds were able to have a lot more places to nest, and so we even saw more songbirds in the park. The wolves were able to bring balance also to the coyote population. When the wolves were removed from the park, there were a lot of coyotes that they became the main predator. And so when the coyotes had the wolves to compete with, there were more rabbits in the park because there were less coyotes hunting on those rabbits, and there were more foxes because there were less coyotes and more rabbits, and because there were more rabbits, there were more hawks and more eagles to be able to hunt on those smaller rodents. And because the wolves also were able to hunt really big game like deer and elk, a lot of scavengers were introduced to the park because the wolves would leave behind the carcasses of the animals that they would hunt, and so they'd leave behind an elk carcass, and eagles could come feed on that, or bears could come feed on that. And so they saw their bear population in Yellowstone spike up. And the wolves were also kept in balance by the cougar population. There were cougars that were able to hunt the wolves and not allow the wolves to overpopulate as well. And so there were a lot of species that were affected. There were beavers introduced, birds, hawks, eagles, bears, frogs. All of these animals were able to increase their population because the wolves were introduced. And so that is a really elaborate example of a keystone species. And we like to call that a trophic cascade. When there is a species at the top of a food web, and it affects every species below it in the food web, that is a top to bottom, so top down effect, and that is called a trophic cascade. And so these wolves created a trophic cascade, so they were able to bring so much more balance and health to the ecosystem. And because we saw that this is what the rivers looked like without the wolves there, I want to show you what the rivers looked like with the wolves there. And so not only were the animals and the plants affected, but also the abiotic factors like the rivers and the rocks and the soil were also affected with wolves. And so this is what the rivers looked like when the wolves were there. And so you can see how healthy this river is. It's deeper, it's straighter, it has steeper banks, and so you can see there are so many more trees and grass and shrubbery along the sides of this river. And that is because the deer and elk could not come all the way out in the open and feed on whatever they wanted. They had to be strategic. They had to stay in more sheltered areas, and so they allowed these plants to grow back and create a healthier ecosystem and a more beautiful river. And so that is an example of a keystone species, and those were a couple examples. And you can see that keystone species are, like I said, the glue that holds an ecosystem together. And so it's really important that we protect these species, that we make sure that they are able to thrive in their environment, and that they are able to bring balance and health into these ecosystems. So I hope you enjoyed this Life Science Live. Thank you so much for watching. And please join us next week when we do another Life Science Live, more discovery reading, and more behind the scenes views of our museum. But thank you so much. Bye.